Okay, let's start class. So let's review where we are. We are discussing or exploring why the United States would want to invade Iran. And so far, we have two good reasons. The first good reason is called the Israel lobby. There are in the Israel lobby millions of Christian Zionists who believe that a conflict in the Middle East, especially between Israel and Iran, will bring Jesus back to earth. They want their God, Jesus, to return to earth, and they believe that a war in the Middle East will force him to return. Okay, that's the first reason. Second reason is the idea of empire. America is an empire, and as an empire, it has a lot of privileges. For example, it can just print as much money as it wants, right? US dollars. Right now, America is $34 trillion in debt, and the debt is growing by $1 trillion every 2 months. America can do this as long as it is an empire, as long as people fear America. But as we discussed last class, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, people are now starting to rebel against the empire, and therefore America must demonstrate it still is the military hegemon of the world, and therefore it can do this by invading Iran. Okay? Today we look at the third and final force driving conflict in the Middle East. And it's really the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Most people think that Iran's major enemy in the Middle East is Israel. In fact, Iran's major enemy is Saudi Arabia. These two are bitter rivals. And to understand why, we have to look at their history. Okay? So the year is 1979. At the start of 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran are very good friends. Okay? So let's look at a map of the Middle East. Iran is here. It's next to Iraq. Saudi Arabia is down here. Then this is Egypt. You have Yemen here, Oman. This is the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the Suez Canal, okay? The Red Sea, basically. And in 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran were very good friends. They had a lot of similarities. They were both monarchies. They were ruled by a king. They were secular. They relied on American power to defend itself. And they were both oil exporters, both very prosperous oil exporters. But then, in 1979, a political earthquake radically changed the landscape of the Middle East. In 1979, there was a bottom-up revolution called the Islamic Revolution. Before 1979, there was a general consensus agreement in the Middle East that religion and politics would be separated. But in 1979, the people in Iran demanded three things. Okay? First, they demanded that the king, they will not be ruled by a king. Okay? That's the first demand. Second is that the U.S. should not interfere in domestic politics. Remember that before the king, the Shah, was supported by the American military. And the third demand is that as a Muslim people, as people who believe in the Islamic religion, the government should be focused on Islamic law. Okay? So, in a referendum, 98% of the people of Iran voted to install an Islamic republic to replace their monarchy. And this was completely unexpected, and this caused an earthquake throughout the Middle East. In November of 1979, 600 religious extremists tried to besiege Mecca, okay? Mecca is the holiest city in the Islamic religion because it's the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. 600 extremists tried to take the city over and demand three things, okay? That the Saudi Arabian monarchy should abdicate. The United States should remove itself from the internal affairs of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia should be governed by Islamic law. Now, this revolt was crushed by the military, but from that day on, Iran and Saudi Arabia became bitter enemies because they were both trying to install their vision of Islam on the Middle East. Okay? So this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia took three forms. Okay? The first form is religious. So even though they're both Muslim countries, Islamic countries, they have different versions of the religion. Okay? So Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and Iran is Shiite. Now, you may ask what the difference between these two different branches of the religion are. And the answer is no one actually knows. It's a very complicated issue. The major difference is this. In 610, the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, in the city of Medina, he had a vision to found a new religion called Islam, okay? And he spread this religion throughout the Middle East, throughout the Arab world, forever transforming the Middle East. When he died, there's a problem of succession. Who would succeed the Prophet as the leader of the religion? The Shia people believe that only people of Muhammad's bloodline can be the leaders of the religion. The Sunni disagreed and said that anyone who proved himself competent and faithful to religion could be the leader. And so for hundreds of years, these two groups, the Sunni and the Shia, fought a war over the succession. And this led to a bitter rivalry that's lasted to this day, okay? Now, the majority of people in the world, about 8%, are Sunni, okay? The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni. 10% are Shia, okay? So why this is important is that Saudi Arabia is a Sunni country, and Iran is a Shia country. And at the time of the revolution, Iran committed itself to spreading the Shia revolution throughout the world, okay? Now, Saudi Arabia considers itself the leader of the Islamic world because it is home to both Mecca and Medina, which are the two holiest cities in the entire Islamic religion. As you may know, there's a requirement that as a Muslim, you must take a Hajj, a pilgrimage, to Mecca and Medina once in your lifetime. Okay? And because Saudi Arabia controls Mecca and Medina, that's really the source of Saudi Arabia's authority over the Islamic world. Iran argues that because Saudi Arabia is ruled by a king, that's anti-Muslim. And because the United States is defended by the US military, that's also anti-Muslim. Saudi Arabia is a heresy, okay? So Iran is dedicated itself to subverting Saudi Arabia's authority. Okay, so does this all make sense so far? Okay. Now, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and it practices the most extreme form of Sunni religion called Wahhabism. Okay, Wahhabism. In 1744, the Wahhabis, okay, which again are the most extreme Islamic group, made an alliance with the Al Saud family of Saudi Arabia. And the agreement was this, that the Wahhabism would become the national religion of Saudi Arabia, and the Wahhabis would swear allegiance to the Al Saud family. Okay? But in the 1930s, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia. In fact, Saudi Arabia proved to have the most valuable oil resources in all the world, okay? And at that time, as the world was modernizing, oil was becoming more and more important. And so that made Saudi Arabia extremely wealthy. And as it became more and more wealthy, it tried to become more Western, more secular, more progressive, more modern, which brought it into conflict with the Wahhabis, okay? Now, Wahhabism accounts for 20 to 40% of all the people in Saudi Arabia. So it is a very significant group. More important, Wahhabi people tend to be extremely fanatical. So for example, in 1979, the people who laid siege to Mecca were Wahhabis. And Wahhabis were also responsible for terrorist attacks against tourists, against foreigners in Saudi Arabia. Okay? So Saudi Arabia has always had this problem with the Wahhabis. And a way that Saudi Arabia has tried to resolve the conflict is to export the religion of Wahhabism throughout the world. So for example, Osama bin Laden was a Saudi citizen responsible for spreading Wahhabism in Afghanistan. And that's what started Al-Qaeda. Okay? So Saudi Arabia is trying to export Wahhabism. Iran is trying to export the Shia religion. And so that they come into conflict with each other, okay? So the first source of tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia is over religion. Second is economical. And what that means is that both countries are oil exporters. In fact, Saudi Arabia is completely reliant on oil for its economy. 40% of Saudi Arabia's economy, GDP, is based on oil exports. Saudi Arabia is #1 oil exporter in the world, okay? 75% of government revenues comes from its oil exports. In other words, Saudi Arabia does not actually collect taxes from its citizens. It just sells oil. Okay? Iran also sells oil. It's the #4 oil exporter in the world, but it's less reliant on oil because it has a diversified economy, meaning that it has very strong human capital. It has a very well-educated population that does all sorts of different activities. Okay, science, art, education. So Saudi Arabia, for the longest time, has been trying to control the price of oil in order to maximize profits. For example, it wants to cut back production in order to increase the price of oil, which will increase profits. But Iran often doesn't cooperate because Iran is trying to sell as much oil as possible in order to boost its economy. Okay? So there's economic conflict between these two countries. And the third and final conflict is geopolitical. Okay? And geopolitical means that both countries are trying to exert as much influence as possible over the Middle East. Now, Iran is trying to exert influence over the Middle East because after the revolution in 1979, many countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United States, encouraged Iraq to invade Iran. And this invasion, called the Iraq-Iran War, lasted 8 years, and it cost the lives of millions of Iranians. And from then on, Iran has adopted a policy of aggressive intervention in the Middle East in order to distract the United States and Israel. Okay? So for example, in Israel, there are two groups opposing Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah. And they're both financed and supported politically by Iran. And the point of doing this is to distract Israel. Okay? Now, Saudi Arabia is trying to exert influence over the Middle East because as the number one oil exporter, it needs to control shipping lanes. Okay? It needs to control this area and this area, the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal. And 40% of all the world's oil passes through these two straits, and they go mainly to East Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan mainly. Okay? So because of these geopolitical tensions, Iran and Saudi Arabia have fought three proxy wars, okay? They fought 3 shadow wars. The first is in Iraq. Now in Iraq, as you know, in 2003, America invaded Iraq and destroyed the country. And after they destroyed the country, there's a power vacuum. And so basically, Iran came in and tried to take over the country. And it could do so because 2/3 of the population were Shiite. And therefore, they had affinity with Iran. And 1/3 were Sunni. So what happened was that to counter the Iranian influence in Iraq, Saudi Arabia started to finance the 1/3 of the Sunnis against the Shia. So there was a very violent civil war fought in Iraq after the invasion. Okay? Many people also believe that Saudi Arabia is responsible for the financing of the Islamic State, okay? Or ISIS. Because ISIS really hates the Shia religion. Okay? But over time, because Iran has been so much more effective in projecting its power than Saudi Arabia, basically Iran now controls much of Iraq, okay? So in this first war, Iran defeated Saudi Arabia. Then they fought another war in Syria.